Snowfall blanketed the bustling streets of New York City, muting the usual cacophony of honking taxis and hurried footsteps. The city felt suspended in time, its pace slowed by the hush of winter. Among the shimmering holiday lights and frosted storefronts, a story was about to unfold, one of unlikely encounters and transformative love. It would begin, not with the warmth of holiday cheer, but in the cold, unyielding quiet of a snowstorm, where two lives, vastly different, yet fated to intertwine, would collide. This tale is about the barriers we build around ourselves and the people who dare to break them down. Beneath layers of ice, both literal and figurative, lie secrets, pain, and perhaps redemption. As the snowstorm deepens, so does the mystery of what brought these two souls together on this fateful winter night. And so, our story begins. The snowstorm hit New York City with an intensity that left even its unshakable residents scrambling for shelter. The air was thick with the scent of impending frostbite, and visibility on the streets dropped to a dangerous blur. Alexander Blake, known to the world as the sharp-minded millionaire with a frozen heart, sat alone in a dimly lit cafe. The warmth of the coffee in his hands was a stark contrast to the chill that clung to his every thought. This wasn't where he intended to be tonight. But then again, Alexander hadn't intended much of anything lately. His world, carefully curated and meticulously controlled, had grown colder than the weather outside. The solitude suited him, or so he told himself. As he stared at the flakes tumbling past the frosted window, the cafe door jingled, and with it came a rush of frigid air and chaos. A woman bundled in mismatched scarves and a hat, too big for her head, stumbled in, a gust of wind scattering snowflakes and papers alike. She was carrying a worn leather portfolio that, upon impact with the polished cafe floor, burst open like a dam, spilling sketches and notes in every direction. "Of course," she muttered under her breath, crouching to gather her scattered life with an exasperated huff. The words weren't meant for anyone, but they carried to Alexander's ears like a song of disruption. He watched in silence, his steel-blue eyes narrowing. The woman was a flurry of motion, her cheeks pink from the cold, her brown eyes darting around in embarrassment. Something about her disarray, her defiance against the unforgiving world outside, stirred an unfamiliar curiosity in him. "Here," he said, his deep voice cutting through the air like a knife. He leaned down, picking up one of the papers nearest to his feet. It was a charcoal sketch, a hauntingly beautiful depiction of the very snowstorm raging outside. The detail was impeccable, the emotion raw. Alexander paused, captivated. She glanced up sharply, meeting his gaze. "Thanks," she said, her tone brisk but tinged with surprise. She snatched the sketch from his hand, stuffing it into her portfolio with a muttered, "I've got it." But as she moved to grab another sheet, something else slipped from the pile, a crumpled notice that fluttered to the floor between them. His eyes flicked to it, instinctively. She froze when she realized what he'd seen, her face flushing deeper than the cold could account for. Her hands snatched the notice up quickly, shoving it out of sight. "Mind your business," she snapped, her voice sharp with defensiveness. Alexander raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair with calculated calm. It's hard to ignore something when it's so obvious. Her glare could have melted the snow outside. "Well, congratulations on your observational skills." There was something about her sarcasm, biting, yes, but also laced with vulnerability, that intrigued him. It was rare for anyone to speak to him like this, much less a stranger. "Let me guess," he said, his tone as frosty as the window beside them. "An artist struggling to survive in the big city. You're a walking cliché." "And you," she shot back. Must be the smug millionaire who thinks his wallet can solve everything. And another cliché. Her words landed like a slap, though Alexander's expression didn't waver. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his curiosity deepening. "What's your name?" She hesitated, as if debating whether to dignify him with a response. "Sophia. Sophia Grant." "Well, Sophia," he said, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. It seems fate has a cruel sense of humor to bring two clichés together on a night like this. Before she could respond, the barista interrupted, announcing that the snowstorm had intensified and the cafe would be closing early. The handful of patrons, bundled in scarves and coats, began to trickle out into the night. Sophia moved to leave too, clutching her portfolio tightly. But Alexander stopped her with a single sentence. "Wait." She turned, her eyes narrowing. "What?" His gaze was steady, almost challenging. "What if I could help?" Sophia scoffed, shaking her head. "I don't need your pity." "Good," he said smoothly, "because pity isn't what I'm offering." There was a pause, thick with tension and unspoken words. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in silence. Inside, two strangers stood at a crossroads, their lives on the verge of colliding in ways neither could predict. "Let's make a deal," Alexander said finally, his voice as calm as the storm was wild. "It's a long shot, but I think it could work. For both of us." Sophia folded her arms, her skepticism clear. "What kind of deal?" He smiled, a rare, enigmatic expression. "You'll see." And with that, the first threads of their fateful connection were woven, set against the backdrop of a city frozen in time. The snowstorm hadn't let up by the time Sophia found herself seated across from Alexander in the now quiet cafe. The barista, begrudgingly allowing them to stay a bit longer, shuffled in the background, casting occasional glances their way. Sophia's hands wrapped tightly around her steaming mug of tea, more for comfort than warmth. She hadn't agreed to listen, not officially, but Alexander's enigmatic offer had piqued her curiosity. He leaned back in his chair, every inch the confident businessman, as though the idea he was about to propose had already won her over. The faint flicker of amusement in his otherwise stoic expression annoyed her, but she held her tongue. "I can help solve your problem," he began, his voice low and steady, as if stating a fact rather than making an offer. Sophia bristled. "I don't have a problem." "Really?" Alexander's eyebrows lifted in mock surprise. "Because that overdue rent notice says otherwise." Her fingers tightened around her mug. "That's none of your business." "True," he conceded. "But if you let pride stand in the way, you'll find yourself out in the snow soon enough. I'm offering you a lifeline." Sophia's heart clenched. It wasn't as if she didn't know how precarious her situation was. Rent was overdue, her art supplies were dwindling, and her gallery prospects had dried up months ago. Still, the last thing she wanted was to feel indebted to a stranger, especially one who reeked of privilege and condescension. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked finally, her tone sharp. "A deal," Alexander replied smoothly. "A mutually beneficial arrangement." Sophia narrowed her eyes. "I don't think we have anything to offer each other." "Don't we?" Alexander leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "I need someone convincing, to play the part of my fiancée. For Christmas." The words hung in the air, like the snow outside, suspended and surreal. Sophia blinked, convinced she'd misheard. "Excuse me." "You heard me," he said, unfazed. "I have a family situation that requires me to show up with someone. Someone who can withstand scrutiny, hold her own, and, most importantly, convince them I'm serious." Sophia let out a short, incredulous laugh. You're insane. Possibly, he admitted, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. But I'm also serious. Her mind raced. The audacity of his proposition was almost laughable, but the desperation in her own life made her pause. Why me? You're here, he said simply. And you're unconventional. Sophia frowned. Unconventional? What's that supposed to mean? It means you're not what they'd expect. That's the point. Alexander's tone remained calm, but there was a subtle challenge in his words, daring her to question him further. And what do I get out of this? She asked, crossing her arms. A considerable sum of money, he replied without hesitation. Enough to cover your rent, and then some. Think of it as an investment in your future. The word money caught her off guard. She hated how her heart skipped at the thought. But was it worth her dignity? Why not hire an actress or, I don't know, someone willing to play pretend? Because this isn't pretend, he said, his tone growing serious. It has to be real. My family will see through anything less. Sophia stared at him, searching for any sign of deceit. There was none. He was entirely, maddeningly serious. I don't know anything about you, she said finally. And I don't know anything about you, Alexander countered. That's the beauty of it. No shared history, no complications. Sophia opened her mouth to argue, but he interrupted her. Think about it this way, he said. You're in a tight spot. I'm offering a way out. In exchange, you endure a few weeks of awkward dinners and probing questions from my family. After Christmas, we go our separate ways. No strings attached. No strings? She repeated skeptically. None, he confirmed. Her thoughts swirled. It sounded too good to be true. But then again, wasn't everything? The snowstorm outside showed no sign of stopping, mirroring the chaos in her mind. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to have the weight of her financial struggles lifted, even temporarily. I'll do it, she said, her voice firm, despite the hesitation bubbling beneath the surface. But I have conditions. Alexander's eyebrow arched. I'm listening. First, you pay up front, she began. Half now, half after Christmas. Agreed, he said without hesitation. Second, I'm not some trophy you can parade around. I keep my dignity. Understood. And third, she continued, leaning forward, this is strictly business. No crossing boundaries. Alexander's lips curved into a faint smile. Agreed. Strictly business. For reasons she couldn't entirely explain, Sophia believed him. Something in his eyes, calm but calculating, suggested he was a man of his word. But what unnerved her more was the feeling that there was something deeper beneath his controlled exterior, something he wasn't telling her. Fine, she got sitting back in her chair. We have a deal. Excellent. Alexander extended his hand, his expression unreadable. Sophia hesitated before shaking it, sealing her fate. As she left the cafe that night, the snow crunching beneath her worn boots, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just signed up for something far more complicated than she'd anticipated. Meanwhile, Alexander watched her go, his mind already calculating the next steps. He'd gotten what he wanted, a fiancée for Christmas, but as the storm continued to rage outside, neither of them realized how much their lives were about to change. The drive to the Blake estate was cloaked in silence, broken only by the hum of the car engine and the occasional crunch of snow under the tires. Sophia gazed out the window, her mind racing, as they sped through Vermont's picturesque countryside. The snowstorm had tapered into a gentle flurry, and the landscape was blanketed in a pristine white sheet, broken by the shadows of towering evergreens. Next to her, Alexander was as unyielding as the ice-caked roads, his hands steady on the steering wheel. He had said little since they left New York, and Sophia didn't press him. She was too preoccupied with her own anxieties, imagining the world she was about to step into. The Blake estate came into view, and Sophia's breath hitched. It wasn't just a house. It was a sprawling mansion, perched on a hill like a fortress. Its stone facade, accented with frosted ivy and tall, arched windows, exuded a timeless elegance. Warm light spilled from the windows, but it did little to soften the imposing grandeur of the place. "Welcome to Wintercrest Manor," Alexander said dryly, pulling the car to a stop at the front entrance. Sophia hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. "Do they always make houses this intimidating?" Alexander's lips quirked in the faintest hint of a smile. "You'll get used to it." As they stepped out, a butler appeared seemingly out of nowhere, bundled against the cold, but impeccably composed. He greeted Alexander with a formal nod, then turned his discerning gaze to Sophia. She straightened under the scrutiny, unwilling to let her unease show. "This way, miss," the butler said, leading her into the mansion. The interior was no less intimidating. Marble floors gleamed under a massive crystal chandelier, and every surface seemed to reflect the kind of wealth that made Sophia painfully aware of her thrift store coat. Her boots squeaked against the polished floor, a sound that echoed like an uninvited guest. "Alexander!" A sharp voice cut through the air, followed by the brisk click of heels. Sophia turned to see a striking woman in her late 50s descending the grand staircase. Her tailored dress and perfectly coiffed hair spoke of old money, and her sharp gaze landed on Sophia with the precision of a hawk. "Mother," Alexander greeted her with a curt nod. "This is Sophia Grant, my fiancée." Margaret Blake's expression didn't falter, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise. "Fiancée?" she repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. "How unexpected." Sophia forced a smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Blake." Margaret gave her a once-over, her polite smile not quite reaching her eyes. "The pleasure is mine, I'm sure." Before Sophia could respond, a younger man strolled into the room, his relaxed posture a stark contrast to Margaret's rigidity. His sharp features and easy charm made him instantly likable, or at least that was the impression he worked hard to give. "Cousin Alexander," the man drawled, his grin widening when he spotted Sophia. "And who's this?" "Sophia," Alexander said flatly. "My fiancé, Elliot. Try to behave." Elliot's eyebrows shot up, but he quickly masked his surprise with a chuckle. "A pleasure, Sophia. Welcome to the circus." "Elliot," Margaret snapped, her tone warning. "Apologies," Elliot said, though his smirk suggested he was anything but sorry. "I'm just saying, it's nice to have some new entertainment around here." Sophia bit back a sharp retort, sensing that Elliot's flippancy was more than just a harmless quirk. There was a glint in his eye that hinted at mischief, and maybe malice. "I'll show Sophia to her room," Alexander interjected, stepping between them. Margaret's gaze lingered on Sophia for a moment longer before she nodded. "Dinner is at 8. Don't be late." The room Alexander led her to was breathtaking, but its beauty did little to ease Sophia's nerves. She stood by the window, staring out at the snow-covered gardens, while Alexander placed her bag on the bed. "This is a lot," she admitted, breaking the silence. "You'll be fine," Alexander said, his tone softer than usual. "Just remember, they don't matter." Sophia turned to him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "The judgment, the scrutiny. It's all noise," he said. "It doesn't define you. Don't let it." For a fleeting moment, the wall between them seemed to crack, and she caught a glimpse of something deeper, something vulnerable. But just as quickly it was gone, replaced by his usual stoic demeanor. "Rest up," he said, heading for the door. "Dinner will be interesting." Interesting was an understatement. The dining room, with its long mahogany table and gilded mirrors, was the epitome of grandeur. But the atmosphere was anything but welcoming. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her icy composure unyielding, while Elliot lounged in his chair, clearly enjoying the tension. Sophia held her own, answering Margaret's probing questions with a mixture of honesty and wit. She refused to let the woman's thinly veiled condescension rattle her, though it was exhausting to maintain the facade. "What do you do, Miss Grant?" Margaret asked, her tone deceptively pleasant. "I'm an artist," Sophia replied. "Mostly illustrations, though I dabble in other mediums." "An artist," Margaret echoed, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How quaint." Sophia clenched her jaw but forced a smile. "It's certainly not for everyone." Elliot chuckled, earning a sharp glare from Margaret. "Well, I, for one, think it's fascinating," he said. "Maybe you could sketch us all sometime. Capture the essence of the Blake family." "I'd need a lot of black ink," Sophia quipped, earning a genuine laugh from Alexander. It was the first time she'd seen him smile like that, and for a moment the tension in the room eased. But it didn't last. As the night wore on, the subtle barbs and veiled criticisms continued, leaving Sophia feeling like a performer in an unwelcome spotlight. When the dinner finally ended, she escaped to her room, her shoulders heavy with the weight of the evening. Alone in the quiet of her room, Sophia let her guard down. She stared at the sketches she'd brought with her, the only pieces of her life that felt real in this gilded cage. Her fingers traced the lines of a half-finished drawing, her mind replaying the day's events. The Blake estate was a mansion of masks, each inhabitant hiding behind a carefully constructed facade. But beneath the surface, Sophia sensed something deeper, secrets and scars that threatened to unravel. And somehow she was now a part of it. The days at Wintercrest Manor settled into an uneasy rhythm. Mornings were marked by a forced civility at breakfast, afternoons by Alexander's mysterious absences, and evenings by the suffocating formality of family dinners. For Sophia, it was a crash course in navigating the labyrinth of the Blake family dynamic, a world where words were weapons and silence held secrets. It was during one of those silent afternoons that Sophia found herself wandering the grand halls of the estate. The Blake mansion was a maze of opulence, each room adorned with antique furniture, intricate tapestries, and paintings that seemed to stare back at her. Yet, despite its grandeur, the house felt cold, its vastness echoing with a loneliness that mirrored its owner. She turned a corner and stumbled upon Alexander's study. The door was ajar, and inside, she could see the glow of a fireplace casting shadows on the walls. Curiosity tugged at her, and before she could think better of it, she stepped inside. The room was as meticulously organized as the man himself. Books lined the shelves in perfect symmetry, and a sleek mahogany desk stood at the center, devoid of clutter. But it was the photographs on the mantelpiece that caught her attention. Among the frames was a picture of a young Alexander, smiling, a stark contrast to the man she knew now. Beside him stood another boy, slightly younger, with the same piercing blue eyes. Sophia picked up the frame, her fingers brushing against the glass. The image was warm, filled with laughter and sunlight, a snapshot of a simpler time. She wondered who the boy was and why he'd never been mentioned. "Enjoying yourself?" Alexander's voice broke the silence, sharp and cold. Sophia spun around, nearly dropping the frame. I was just snooping," he finished, stepping into the room. No, she said defensively, placing the frame back. I was curious. You're not exactly an open book, you know. Alexander's eyes flicked to the photograph, and for a moment his expression softened, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. That was my brother, William. Sophia waited for him to say more, but he didn't. Instead, he moved to his desk and began sorting through papers, his movements stiff. What happened to him? She asked hesitantly. Alexander froze, his back to her. He died, he said simply, the words heavy with finality. Sophia's breath caught. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry. You weren't prying, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. William was different. He saw the world in a way I never could. He believed in people, in second chances, and he paid the price for it. There was a weight to his words that Sophia didn't fully understand, but she could see the pain in his eyes, even if he tried to hide it. For a moment, she considered pressing further, but something told her this was as much as he was willing to share. Later that evening, Sophia found herself alone in the library. The Blake family dinner had been its usual minefield of veiled criticisms and pointed remarks, and she needed a moment to breathe. The library was one of the few places in the mansion that felt genuinely warm, its walls lined with books that seemed to absorb the coldness of the house. As she browsed the shelves, a voice interrupted her thoughts. Can't sleep, either. She turned to see Margaret standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. It was the first time Sophia had seen her outside the rigid context of their formal interactions. Just needed some air, Sophia replied cautiously. Margaret stepped inside, her sharp heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The library was always my favorite room, she said, her tone softer than usual. A sanctuary of sorts? Sophia wasn't sure how to respond, so she nodded, waiting for the inevitable critique. But to her surprise, Margaret's gaze softened as she looked at the books. Alexander mentioned you're an artist, Margaret said, her voice almost wistful. William was too. He used to draw the most beautiful sketches of this house, before it became what it is now. Sophia hesitated. What do you mean? Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. This house, it's a monument to my husband's ambition. Everything in it is designed to impress, to intimidate. But it wasn't always like this. There was a time when it felt alive. The vulnerability in Margaret's voice caught Sophia off guard. She had seen the matriarch as cold and calculating, but now there was a hint of something else, regret perhaps. I think William would have liked you, Margaret said suddenly, her gaze piercing. You remind me of him. He had a way of seeing the good in people, even when they didn't deserve it. Sophia wasn't sure what to say. She had spent so much time trying to prove herself to Margaret, to Alexander, to everyone in this house. But for the first time, she felt like she didn't have to. Thank you, she said finally. Margaret nodded, her composure returning. Don't thank me yet, she said, turning to leave. This family has a way of breaking even the strongest spirits. The next morning, Sophia woke to find an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a note scrawled in an elegant hand. Be careful who you trust. Not everyone in this house has your best interests at heart. There was no signature, but Sophia had a sinking feeling she knew exactly who it was from. Elliot had been unusually quiet at dinner the night before, his sly remarks replaced by a watchful silence. It was as if he was biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sophia tucked the note into her sketchbook, her mind racing. The mansion, with all its grandeur and beauty, was a house of secrets, and she was determined to uncover them, no matter the cost. The morning broke with a pale light that barely touched the frost-covered windows of Wintercrest Manor. Sophia stood by her window, the mysterious note from the night before still tucked in her sketchbook. The warning played on her mind as she watched the sprawling estate grounds slowly awaken under the winter sun. Breakfast was a quieter affair than usual. Alexander, usually composed and stoic, appeared distracted, his gaze lingering on the frost-covered panes, as if they held answers to unspoken questions. Margaret's sharp eyes missed nothing. Though she remained silent, her expressions a carefully controlled mask. Elliot, on the other hand, exuded an unsettling calmness, his usual sly remarks replaced with polite indifference. Sophia felt the weight of unspoken tension pressing down on her. She knew she needed answers, not just about the family, but about Alexander himself. The photograph of William haunted her, as did Alexander's cryptic remarks about his brother's tragic fate. That afternoon, Sophia found herself wandering the expansive grounds, drawn to a small garden on the eastern side of the property. The garden, overgrown and neglected, seemed out of place compared to the meticulously maintained rest of the estate. At its center stood a weathered stone bench, its surface etched with initials and dates that had long since faded. Margaret's voice startled her. This was William's favorite spot. Sophia turned to see the older woman, standing a few feet away, her gaze fixed on the bench. For a moment, she seemed lost in a memory, her usual guarded demeanor softened by the quiet melancholy of the garden. He used to spend hours here, Margaret continued, stepping closer, sketching, reading, dreaming. He saw beauty in everything, even in this cold, harsh place. Sophia hesitated before speaking. What happened to him? Margaret's expression tightened, but she didn't look away. William was different, she said carefully. He was kind, gentle, and far too trusting for his own good. In a family like ours, that's not a trait that's valued. Sophia waited, sensing there was more to the story. He got involved with someone, Margaret said finally. A woman who wasn't suitable by our standards. My husband, Alexander's father, saw to it that the relationship ended. But William couldn't forgive him. He left, and shortly after, there was an accident. Her voice broke slightly, and she quickly composed herself. Alexander was never the same after that. He blamed himself, though he'd done nothing wrong. Sophia's heart ached for the boy Alexander must have been, carrying the weight of a tragedy he couldn't control. And you? She asked softly. Do you blame yourself? Margaret's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, the icy veneer cracked. Every day. Later that evening, Sophia decided to confront Alexander. She found him in the study, the room dimly lit by the glow of the fireplace. He was seated at his desk, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring at the photograph of William. Do you always walk into rooms uninvited? He asked without looking up. Sophia ignored his sharp tone and crossed the room to stand beside him. Why didn't you tell me about your brother? Alexander sighed, setting the glass down. Because it's none of your concern. It is, if it's part of the reason you've built these walls around yourself, she countered. He looked at her then, his blue eyes stormy. You think you know me? You think one tragic story explains who I am? No, Sophia said firmly. But it explains why you're afraid to let anyone in. You've lost people, Alexander. And now, instead of risking that pain again, you keep everyone at arm's length. For a moment he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more vulnerable. William was everything I'm not. He believed in people, in second chances. He thought he could change the world with kindness. But kindness doesn't protect you from the harsh realities of life. Sophia placed a hand on his arm. Kindness isn't weakness, Alexander. And maybe, if you let yourself believe that, you'll find it's not too late to change. The following day, Sophia's resolve to understand the family deepened. She decided to visit the town nearby, hoping to learn more about the Blakes and their history. At the local library, she combed through old newspapers, searching for any mention of William. It didn't take long to find what she was looking for. A headline from 15 years ago caught her eye. Local heir found dead in suspected suicide. The accompanying article described how William Blake had been discovered at the edge of the estate, his car submerged in the frozen lake. Sophia's stomach churned as she read the details. The article painted a picture of a troubled young man, torn between family expectations and personal desires. It mentioned a woman, unnamed, who had been involved with him and suggested that the scandal surrounding their relationship had pushed William to the brink. Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The timing, the circumstances, it all felt too convenient. And then there was Elliot, whose behavior seemed more calculated with each passing day. Returning to the mansion, Sophia found Elliot waiting for her in the foyer, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Had a productive day?" he asked, his tone dripping with mock sincerity. Sophia's grip tightened on her bag. "What do you want, Elliot?" "Just a friendly warning," he said, stepping closer. "You're playing a dangerous game, digging into things that don't concern you." Sophia met his gaze, refusing to back down. "Maybe they should concern me." Elliot chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Careful, Sophia. This family has a way of devouring anyone who doesn't belong." That night, as Sophia lay in bed, her mind raced with everything she had learned. The Blake family's secrets were deeper and darker than she had imagined, and she was caught in the middle of it all. But one thing was clear. She wasn't going to let Elliot or anyone else scare her away. For the first time since arriving at Wintercrest Manor, Sophia felt a sense of purpose. She didn't know how or when, but she was determined to uncover the truth about William's death and the shadows that still lingered over the Blake family. The morning light filtered through the frosted windows of Wintercrest Manor, casting an ethereal glow on the grand estate. Despite the serene beauty outside, tension brewed within its walls, thick and suffocating. Sophia woke with a sense of unease, her thoughts dominated by the revelations of the previous day and the ominous warning Elliot had delivered. Breakfast was a subdued affair. Alexander, as usual, appeared cool and unreadable, but there was a faint edge to his demeanor. Margaret's sharp glances darted between him and Sophia, her usual air of quiet control strained. Elliot, however, seemed uncharacteristically relaxed, his smile almost too smug, his words dripping with concealed malice. Sophia's resolve hardened. Whatever Elliot was plotting, she wouldn't let him manipulate her or Alexander any further. She decided to confront Alexander, to tell him what she discovered about William, and to demand the truth about Elliot's role in the family's dysfunction. Later that morning, she found Alexander in the study, staring out the window at the snow-covered grounds. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the room felt cold. Sophia stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. "We need to talk," she said firmly. Alexander turned, his expression guarded. "About what?" "About your brother," Sophia said. "About William." His eyes narrowed, a flicker of pain crossing his face before it was quickly masked. "What about him?" "I know about the accident," she said, stepping closer. "I know about the woman he loved and how your father forced him to end it. But I also know there's more to the story, something you're not telling me." Alexander's jaw tightened. "You've been digging into things that don't concern you." They concern me if they explain why Elliot is so determined to discredit me, Sophia shot back. If they explain why this family is still haunted by a tragedy that no one wants to talk about. For a moment, Alexander said nothing, his gaze fixed on the floor. Then he looked up, his eyes stormy. You think you can waltz in here and fix things? That you can solve problems you don't even understand? Sophia took a step closer, her voice steady. I'm not trying to fix anything, Alexander. I just want to understand. But I can't do that if you keep shutting me out. The confrontation escalated when Elliot walked in, his smirk widening at the sight of their heated exchange. Am I interrupting something? He asked, his tone dripping with feigned innocence. Sophia turned to him, her frustration boiling over. What are you trying to accomplish, Elliot? Do you enjoy stirring up trouble? Or is there something more you're hiding? Elliot feigned shock, placing a hand over his heart. Me? Stirring up trouble? You wound me, Sophia. Enough, Alexander said sharply, his voice cutting through the tension. He glared at Elliot. Whatever game you're playing, it ends now. Elliot's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. You're awfully protective of her, Alexander. Makes one wonder why. Before Alexander could respond, Margaret appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. That's enough, all of you, she said, her tone firm. This family has enough skeletons in its closet, without adding more drama. That evening, Sophia retreated to her room, feeling both defeated and determined. She knew she had struck a nerve with Alexander, but the walls he had built around himself were thicker than she'd anticipated. She needed a new approach, one that would help her earn his trust rather than force it. She decided to focus on Elliot. If she could uncover his motivations, perhaps she could use that information to protect herself and Alexander. But Elliot wasn't her only concern. The mysterious heirloom Margaret had mentioned lingered in her mind, as did the question of William's true fate. The next morning, Sophia took a walk through the estate grounds, seeking clarity. She found herself drawn to the overgrown garden where she had first learned about William. The air was crisp, and the snow crunched beneath her boots as she approached the stone bench at the garden's center. To her surprise, she wasn't alone. Margaret was there, sitting on the bench with a small box in her lap. She looked up as Sophia approached, her expression softer than usual. I thought you might come here, Margaret said, gesturing for Sophia to sit beside her. Sophia hesitated before sitting down. What's in the box? She asked. Margaret opened it, revealing a collection of photographs, letters, and a small locket. Memories, she said quietly. Pieces of a life that ended too soon. She handed the locket to Sophia, who opened it to find a tiny portrait of a young man and woman. Is this William and the woman he loved? Sophia asked. Margaret nodded. Her name was Clara. She was an artist, much like you. William adored her, but she wasn't from the right social class. My husband couldn't see past that. He drove her away, and it broke William's heart. Sophia's chest tightened as she looked at the locket. And the accident? Margaret's hands trembled as she closed the box. There are things I've never told anyone, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Things I'm not even sure I want to know the answers to. Sophia spent the rest of the day poring over the letters Margaret had shared with her. They painted a picture of a deeply loving relationship between William and Clara, as well as the growing strain William felt from his family's expectations. One letter in particular stood out. It was dated just a week before the accident and contained a cryptic line that sent chills down Sophia's spine. If something happens to me, promise me you'll keep looking for the truth. Sophia's resolve hardened. Whatever had happened to William, it wasn't an accident, and she was determined to find out the truth even if it meant confronting the darkest secrets of the Blake family. That night, Sophia found Alexander in the study once again. He looked up as she entered, his expression weary. "I found something," she said, holding up the letter. "Something that might change everything." Alexander took the letter and read it, his face darkening with each word. When he finished, he looked up at Sophia, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and determination. "If you're right," he said, "then we've been living a lie for 15 years. Sophia nodded. "And it's time to uncover the truth." The silence in the study was oppressive, broken only by the faint crackle of the fireplace. Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he set the letter down on the desk, its weight far greater than the thin paper implied. He glanced at Sophia, her determination written across her face. "This letter," he said slowly, his voice heavy with disbelief. "It changes everything." Sophia nodded. "We need to figure out what really happened, Alexander. This isn't just about William. It's about your family's entire legacy." For a long moment, Alexander said nothing, his gaze distant. Then, with a sharp exhale, he stood. "If we're going to do this, we'll need help. And I know just the person." The following day, Alexander made a call to his old friend David Connors, a private investigator known for his discretion and tenacity. David arrived at Wintercrest Manor that evening, his sharp eyes scanning the room as Alexander introduced him to Sophia. "This is quite the case you've got," David said, holding up the letter. "I've handled a lot of mysteries, but family secrets tend to be the most tangled." Sophia and Alexander exchanged a glance. "We're ready to untangle it," Sophia said firmly. David smirked. "Good. Let's start with the basics. I'll need access to everything: family records, correspondence, anything that could give us a lead." While David began his investigation, Sophia turned her focus to Elliot. She knew he was hiding something, and his smug demeanor suggested he believed he had the upper hand. Determined to prove him wrong, Sophia decided to confront him directly. She found Elliot in the drawing room, sipping a glass of brandy and flipping through a magazine. He looked up as she entered, his smile sharp and condescending. "Well, if it isn't our intrepid investigator," he drawled. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Sophia crossed her arms. "Cut the act, Elliot. I know you're hiding something about William's death." Elliot's smile didn't waver, but his eyes darkened. "You're barking up the wrong tree, darling. William's death was a tragedy, yes, but there's nothing more to it than that." "Then why do you seem so intent on discrediting me?" Sophia shot back. "What are you afraid I'll find?" Elliot's expression hardened. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This family has skeletons you can't even imagine. If you're smart, you'll stop digging before you end up regretting it." Sophia's resolve didn't falter. "I'm not afraid of the truth, Elliot. Can you say the same?" Meanwhile, David's investigation uncovered a key piece of evidence: a financial transaction between Alexander's father and a mysterious third party, dated just days before William's accident. The amount was substantial, and the recipient's name was blacked out. It was a clear indication that something illicit had taken place. "This is our first real lead," David said, showing the document to Alexander and Sophia. "Whoever received this money might have had a role in what happened to William." Alexander clenched his fists. "That bastard," he muttered, his anger directed at his late father. He was always controlling, always pulling the strings. But to go this far— Sophia placed a hand on his arm. "We'll figure this out, Alexander. Together." As the days passed, the investigation began to take its toll. Alexander grew more withdrawn, the weight of his family's secrets pressing heavily on him. Sophia tried to be there for him, but she could feel the distance growing between them. One evening, as they sat together in the study, Sophia finally voiced her concerns. "You're shutting me out again," she said quietly. "I know this is hard for you, but we're supposed to be in this together." Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's just, everything I thought I knew about my family is unraveling. I don't know who to trust anymore." "You can trust me," Sophia said firmly. "We'll get through this, Alexander, but only if we face it together." He looked at her, his gaze softening. "You're right," he said. I don't want you to get hurt." Sophia smiled faintly. "I'm stronger than I look, and I'm not going anywhere." David's investigation led them to a name: Victor Kane, a former business associate of Alexander's father. Kane had disappeared shortly after William's death, but David managed to track him down to a small town a few hours' drive from Wintercrest Manor. Sophia and Alexander decided to confront Kane together, their determination outweighing their apprehension. They found him living in a rundown house on the outskirts of town, a shadow of the man he had once been. When they questioned him about the transaction, Kane initially denied any involvement, but as Alexander pressed him, his facade began to crack. "All right, fine," Kane finally exclaimed. "Your father paid me to keep quiet. William's death wasn't an accident. It was a setup." Sophia's heart sank. "A setup for what?" she asked. Kane hesitated, his gaze darting between them. "William was planning to leave the family business. He wanted to start a new life with that girl, Clara. Your father couldn't let that happen. He thought it would ruin the family's reputation." Alexander's fists clenched. "So, he had William killed?" Kane shook his head. "It wasn't supposed to go that far. He just wanted to scare him, to make him fall in line. But something went wrong." Sophia's stomach churned. "What went wrong?" she demanded. Kane looked away. "I don't know. All I know is that your father regretted it until the day he died." As they drove back to Wintercrest Manor, the weight of Kane's confession hung heavily in the air. Alexander was silent, his jaw clenched as he stared out the window. Sophia reached over and took his hand, offering silent support. "We'll figure this out," she said softly. "We'll get justice for William." Alexander nodded, but his expression was grim. "It's not just about William anymore," he said. "It's about everything this family has built, and everything it's destroyed." Back at the manor, they shared the news with David and Margaret. Margaret was visibly shaken by Kane's confession, her composure finally cracking. "I always suspected your father had something to do with William's death," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I never imagined it was this." Sophia placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We'll get to the bottom of this," she said, "and we'll make sure the truth comes out." As the fire crackled in the hearth, the four of them sat together, their resolve stronger than ever. The truth was finally within reach, but they knew it wouldn't come without a cost. The wind howled through the snow-draped pines as Alexander stared out at the vast expanse of Wintercrest's grounds, now blanketed in icy white. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air, but it wasn't the cold that chilled him. It was the revelation that his family's legacy was built on manipulation, lies, and death. Inside, the warmth of the manor contrasted sharply with the frost outside. Sophia sat by the fireplace, a sketch pad balanced on her knees. Her hand moved in measured strokes, though her focus wavered. Her thoughts lingered on Alexander and the storm brewing within him. That evening, Sophia found him in his study, hunched over a decanter of whiskey. The shadows cast by the firelight painted his face in somber hues. She approached cautiously, her voice gentle but firm. "Alexander, you can't keep running from this. We need to talk." He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the amber liquid in his glass. "Talking won't change what I've learned," he said quietly. "My father destroyed lives. My brother's death wasn't an accident. It was a result of his schemes. How do I even begin to face that?" Sophia moved closer, her hand resting on his shoulder. "By accepting that you're not him," she said. "You're not bound by his mistakes. You can choose to be better." He finally turned to her, his gaze searching hers. "But what if it's in my blood? What if I'm doomed to repeat his sins?" She shook her head. "You've already proven you're different. The fact that this torments you shows how deeply you care. That's what sets you apart." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Margaret entered, her normally steely demeanor softened by an air of vulnerability. She carried a small, ornate box, its brass hinges tarnished with age. "I think it's time you had this," she said, placing the box on the desk. "It belonged to your father, but it's always been more of a burden than a treasure." Alexander opened the box hesitantly. Inside was a stack of letters and photographs, along with a gold locket. One photo caught his eye, a candid shot of his father, William, and a young woman with kind eyes. Her smile was warm, a stark contrast to the icy facade Alexander remembered his father wearing. "Clara," Margaret said softly, her voice tinged with regret. "She was William's world. Your father despised her, not because she was unsuitable, but because she made William question everything." Sophia leaned in, her curiosity piqued. "Who was she?" Margaret sighed. "A teacher, from a modest background. She and William planned to leave everything behind and start anew. But your father, he couldn't bear the thought of losing control." As the days passed, Sophia found herself grappling with her own turmoil. Alexander was finally opening up, but the weight of his family's secrets threatened to consume him. She felt an increasing need to protect him, even if it meant putting her own vulnerabilities aside. One snowy afternoon, she retreated to the estate's library, hoping to lose herself in the world of her sketches. But her thoughts kept drifting back to Alexander. Her hand moved absent-mindedly, sketching the contours of his face. When she realized what she'd drawn, a blush crept up her cheeks. "You've captured his likeness perfectly," came a voice from behind her. She turned to see Margaret, a rare smile gracing her lips. Sophia laughed nervously, closing the sketch pad. "It's just a habit. Drawing helps me think." Margaret sat beside her, her gaze softening. "You've brought something to this house that I thought was long lost. Hope. For that, I'm grateful." Sophia looked at her in surprise. "I'm just trying to help, Alexander." "And you're succeeding," Margaret said. "But don't forget to take care of yourself too." The turning point came when David uncovered a crucial lead. Victor Kane's confession had been a breakthrough, but it was a ledger buried in the depths of the family archives that provided the missing link. It detailed financial transactions implicating not just Alexander's father, but also several prominent figures in the region. "This isn't just a family scandal," David said, laying the ledger on the desk. "This is a web of corruption that spans decades." Alexander's jaw tightened. "And it's time we cut through it." But before they could act, the ledger went missing. Elliot had struck again, his cunning tactics leaving them reeling. "He's trying to bury the truth," Sophia said, her voice shaking with frustration. "We can't let him win." Determined to retrieve the ledger, Alexander and Sophia devised a plan. David tracked Elliot to a secluded lodge on the outskirts of town, where he was meeting with powerful allies to finalize their cover-up. The journey to the lodge was treacherous, the snowstorm intensifying with each passing hour. As they approached, the tension between Alexander and Sophia reached its peak. "If something happens, promise me you'll get out of there," Alexander said, his tone unyielding. Sophia glared at him. "Don't you dare treat me like I'm fragile. We're in this together." He sighed, realizing there was no point in arguing. "Just be careful." The confrontation at the lodge was explosive. Alexander and Sophia burst into the room, catching Elliot and his accomplices off guard. A heated argument ensued, with Elliot's smug facade finally cracking under the pressure. "You think you're better than me?" he spat at Alexander. "You've always been the golden boy, but you're just as flawed as the rest of us." "That may be true," Alexander said coldly, "but at least I'm trying to make things right." With Sophia's quick thinking, they managed to recover the ledger. But as they left the lodge, Elliot made one last desperate attempt to stop them. A scuffle broke out, and Alexander found himself face to face with his cousin. "You'll regret this," Elliot hissed. "The truth won't set you free. It'll destroy you." Alexander stared him down, his voice steady. "Then let it. I'd rather live with the truth than hide behind lies." Back at Wintercrest Manor, the ledger became the cornerstone of their case. Alexander and Sophia worked tirelessly with David to prepare for the fallout. But the night's events had left them both shaken. As they sat by the fire, Sophia leaned her head against Alexander's shoulder. "We did it," she said softly. "We're one step closer." He wrapped an arm around her, his voice tinged with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you." For the first time in weeks, they allowed themselves a moment of peace. But they knew the battle was far from over. The snow continued to fall outside, a reminder of the storm still brewing. The snowstorm had subsided by morning, leaving behind a serene, untouched blanket of white across Wintercrest Manor's sprawling estate. Sophia stood by the window of her guest room, watching the golden morning light glint off the snow. For the first time since arriving at the Blake family estate, she felt the faintest glimmer of peace. But she knew this was merely the calm before the next storm. Breakfast at the Blake estate was unusually quiet. Margaret Blake sipped her tea with an air of contemplation, her usual sharpness tempered by the events of the previous night. Alexander sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, while Sophia tried to navigate the tension in the room. Elliot was conspicuously absent, and his absence spoke volumes. The confrontation at the lodge had exposed his duplicity, leaving the family reeling. Though he had fled, the damage he had inflicted remained. "Elliot won't go quietly," Margaret finally said, breaking the silence. "He's always been resourceful when it comes to self-preservation." Alexander's jaw tightened, his grip on his coffee cup visibly firm. "He can try all he wants. We have the ledger, and we're going to use it." Margaret met his gaze, her expression softening for the briefest moment. "Just be careful, Alexander. You're fighting a battle that goes beyond this family." Sophia had become more than just a bystander in the Blake family saga. Her resilience and resourcefulness had earned her a place in Alexander's inner circle, but it also meant she was now deeply entangled in the chaos. She spent her days working alongside Alexander and David, meticulously organizing the evidence they had collected. The ledger was a treasure trove of information, linking Elliot and his allies to decades of corruption. But as they delved deeper, the scale of the conspiracy became increasingly daunting. Every name on this list represents someone who's profited from the suffering of others, Sophia said one evening, her voice heavy with emotion. "How do we even begin to take them all down?" Alexander looked at her, his expression softening. "One step at a time. We expose the truth, and we let the world decide what happens next. While Sophia and Alexander worked to piece together the puzzle, Margaret took on a quieter, yet equally significant role. She began to open up to Sophia, revealing a side of herself that few had ever seen. One afternoon, Margaret invited Sophia to join her in the estate's grand library. The room was a treasure trove of history, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes and family artifacts. "I thought you might appreciate this," Margaret said, gesturing to a small wooden chest. Inside were sketches, letters, and photographs, mementos of Alexander's childhood. Sophia carefully examined the contents, her heart aching at the glimpses of a boy who had grown up under immense pressure. "He never talks about his childhood," she said softly. Margaret sighed. "There's a lot he doesn't talk about. My husband was a difficult man, and Alexander bore the brunt of it. But he's stronger than he realizes." Sophia looked at Margaret, her admiration for the older woman growing. "He's lucky to have you. You've done more for him than you give yourself credit for." Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. "And he's lucky to have you. Don't underestimate the impact you've had on him, Sophia." Despite the relative calm, Elliot's presence lingered like a specter over Wintercrest. Though he had disappeared, his allies were still active, and their influence was formidable. One evening, David returned from a meeting with a grim expression. "Elliot's rallying his supporters," he said. "He's spinning the narrative, making it look like you're the villain, Alexander." Sophia felt a surge of anger. "He's trying to deflect blame and protect himself. We can't let him get away with this." Alexander nodded, his resolve unshaken. "We won't. But we need to be strategic. If we act too hastily, we risk undermining everything we've worked for." Amidst the turmoil, there were moments of light. Sophia's art began to flourish, providing her with a much-needed outlet for her emotions. Encouraged by Alexander, she turned one of the estate's unused rooms into a makeshift studio, where she could lose herself in her work. One day, as she was sketching a portrait of the estate's snowy grounds, Alexander entered the room. He watched her in silence for a moment before speaking. "You've brought something to this house that's been missing for a long time," he said. Sophia looked up at him, her cheeks flushing. "I'm just doing what I can." He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You're doing more than that. You're making this place feel like home again." The sincerity in his voice took her by surprise. For a moment, she saw past the stoic exterior to the man beneath, a man who was learning to let his walls down. As the days passed, the pieces of their plan began to fall into place. With David's legal expertise and Margaret's connections, they developed a strategy to expose Elliot and his network. It would require careful timing and coordination, but the potential payoff was worth the risk. Sophia played a key role in the plan, using her artistic talents to create visual aids that would help present their case to the public. Her work added a personal touch to the evidence, highlighting the human cost of the corruption they were fighting against. "You have a way of making people see the bigger picture," Alexander said, as he reviewed her sketches. "It's a gift." Sophia smiled, grateful for his encouragement. "I just hope it makes a difference." The arrival of spring in Vermont was marked by the gentle thawing of snow, revealing patches of green that promised renewal. Wintercrest Manor, once shrouded in icy silence, began to hum with quiet energy. Inside its grand walls, the dynamics were shifting. The tension that had once defined the Blake family's interactions was giving way to tentative warmth, and at the heart of this transformation were Alexander and Sophia. Sophia stood on the terrace, her easel positioned to capture the changing landscape. Her brushstrokes danced across the canvas, bringing life to the image of blossoming cherry trees in the distance. Behind her, Alexander watched quietly. His usual guarded expression softened. "You've made this place beautiful again," he said, his voice cutting through the tranquil air. Sophia turned, her cheeks coloring faintly. "I think the place has always been beautiful. It just needed a little attention." He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "It's more than that. You've brought life back to Wintercrest, to all of us." Her heart fluttered at his words, but she masked it with a wry smile. "Careful, Alexander. You're starting to sound poetic." He chuckled, a rare sound that felt like a victory to Sophia. "Don't get used to it." As the days grew longer, Alexander and Sophia spent more time together, often retreating to the estate's expansive gardens. There, amidst blooming roses and wandering paths, their connection deepened. Alexander, once reserved and stoic, began to share glimpses of his past, stories of his childhood, his dreams, and the weight of the family legacy. One afternoon, as they sat beneath a willow tree, he opened up about his father. "He was a hard man," Alexander admitted. "He believed in discipline above all else. There wasn't much room for affection." Sophia placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "That must have been difficult." He nodded, his gaze distant. "It was. But it also taught me the importance of strength. I just never realized that strength could come from vulnerability, too." Sophia's heart ached for him, but she also admired his growth. "You're stronger than you know, Alexander, and you're learning to let people in. That's real strength." Despite the burgeoning romance, the shadow of Elliot loomed large. Though his immediate threats had been mitigated, his influence was still felt in the family's affairs. Margaret, ever the vigilant matriarch, warned Alexander to remain cautious. "Elliot may be gone, but his allies are still out there," she said one evening. "We can't afford to let our guard down." Alexander agreed, but he was determined not to let the tension overshadow the progress they had made. "We'll deal with whatever comes our way," he said resolutely. "But I won't let him take away what we're building here." As spring gave way to summer, the relationship between Alexander and Sophia flourished. Their days were filled with quiet moments of connection, stolen glances, shared laughter, and unspoken understanding. One evening, as they walked along the estate's lake, Alexander reached for Sophia's hand. "You've changed me, you know," he said, his voice low and earnest. Sophia looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "I think we've changed each other." He smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes. "For the better." The weight of his words hung between them, a testament to the journey they had undertaken together. In that moment, the world felt still, as if it were holding its breath for them. Margaret Blake, once wary and skeptical of Sophia, began to see her in a new light. It wasn't just Sophia's resilience or her artistic talent that impressed Margaret. It was her unwavering kindness and the way she had brought out a side of Alexander that Margaret hadn't seen in years. One morning, Margaret found Sophia in the library, sorting through old family photographs. "You've done more for this family than you realize," Margaret said, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. Sophia looked up, surprised. "I just wanted to help." Margaret's expression softened. "And you have. You've brought us together in a way I didn't think was possible." Sophia smiled, touched by the older woman's words. "I think you've done more than you give yourself credit for, Margaret." Just as the Blake family began to settle into their newfound harmony, news arrived that threatened to unravel everything. David informed Alexander that Elliot had resurfaced, rallying his remaining allies to launch a smear campaign against the family. "He's targeting you specifically," David warned. "He's painting you as the villain." claiming you manipulated Sophia and fabricated the evidence against him. Sophia felt a surge of anger. He's trying to discredit us because he's desperate. We can't let him get away with this. Alexander's jaw tightened, his determination unwavering. We won't. We've come too far to let him win now. The challenges ahead only serve to strengthen the bond between Alexander and Sophia. Together, they prepared for the battles to come, leaning on each other for support. Their love, once fragile and uncertain, had grown into something resilient and unshakable. One evening, as they stood on the terrace watching the sunset, Alexander turned to Sophia. Whatever happens, I want you to know that you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. Sophia smiled, her heart full. And you've changed mine. We're in this together, Alexander. Always, the Blake estate buzzed with preparations for the annual Blake Foundation Gala, a prestigious event meant to showcase the family's commitment to philanthropy. Guests from across the country arrived, draped in elegant gowns and tailored suits. Beneath the glittering chandeliers and polished facade, tensions simmered, threatening to unravel the fragile harmony Alexander and Sophia had worked so hard to build. Elliot's reappearance was both a shock and a calculated move. Despite his disgrace, he strode into the gala with feigned confidence, his every move drawing wary glances from guests and whispered exchanges among the family. Margaret's icy glare barely concealed her contempt as she approached him. "You have no right to be here," she hissed, her voice low but firm. Elliot smirked, unbothered. "I'm still a Blake, Aunt Margaret. This is as much my legacy as it is yours." Alexander stepped in, his presence commanding. "You've done enough damage, Elliot. Leave before you cause more." But Elliot's intentions were clear. He wasn't there to leave quietly. His gaze shifted to Sophia, who stood by Alexander's side, her chin held high, despite the unease in her eyes. "Ah, the infamous Sophia. Quite the rise you've made, haven't you?" Sophia didn't flinch. "Unlike you, I've earned my place here." The room grew quiet, as guests sensed the brewing storm. Elliot's smirk faltered for a brief moment before he turned his attention to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have a few truths to share about the Blakes tonight." Elliot's speech began as a subtle critique, but quickly escalated into a full-blown accusation. He painted Alexander as a manipulative figure who had fabricated evidence against him, claiming the family was covering up financial scandals tied to the foundation. "Do you know where your generous donations really go?" Elliot asked, his voice dripping with malice. "Straight into the pockets of this so-called family." The crowd murmured, their trust in the Blakes visibly shaken. Sophia's heart raced as she watched Alexander's expression harden. She knew the accusations were baseless, but the damage was already being done. As the accusations mounted, Margaret stepped forward, her composed demeanor masking the turmoil within. She took the microphone from Elliot, her voice steady and authoritative. "There are truths in this family that we've kept buried, not out of deceit, but out of pain," Margaret began. But Elliot's words are not among them. Her gaze swept over the crowd before settling on Alexander. "It's time the world knows what we've endured." Margaret revealed the story behind a long-hidden family heirloom, a locket containing a photograph of Alexander's estranged father and his younger brother, James. Years ago, James had fallen victim to a tragic accident, a loss that fractured the family and drove Alexander's father into an emotional abyss. "The decisions we made were not perfect," Margaret admitted, her voice tinged with regret. "But we've spent years trying to mend what was broken. And Alexander has led that effort with integrity and strength." Her words silenced Elliot's tirade, Though the crowd remained uncertain, Sophia stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "This family has shown me what resilience looks like. They're not perfect, but who among us is? What matters is their commitment to change and to each other." Her words resonated, earning murmurs of agreement from the crowd. For the first time, Sophia felt the weight of her role, not just as Alexander's partner, but as someone capable of influencing those around her. Elliot sneered. "And what do you know about this family's history, Sophia?" "You're an outsider." Sophia met his gaze without flinching. "I know enough to see through your lies. You've done nothing but tear people down to elevate yourself. But that stops here." Unbeknownst to Elliot, David and Sophia had been working behind the scenes to gather evidence of his misdeeds. As Elliot's accusations reached their peak, Alexander signaled to David, who stepped forward with a dossier. "This," David announced, holding up the documents, "is proof of Elliot's financial fraud and attempts to sabotage the foundation." The evidence was damning. Bank statements, falsified documents, and testimonies from accomplices. Guests gasped as David detailed Elliot's betrayal, his voice calm but firm. Elliot's confidence crumbled as the room turned against him. Security escorted him out, his protests drowned out by the murmurs of the crowd. In the aftermath, the Blake family gathered in a private room, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Margaret turned to Alexander, her eyes softening. "You handled that well. Your father would have been proud." Alexander nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We still have work to do. But tonight was a start." Sophia placed a hand on his arm. "You showed everyone the truth, and that's what matters." He smiled at her, his gratitude unspoken, but deeply felt. Later that evening, Alexander and Sophia retreated to the terrace, the cool night air wrapping around them. The stars above seemed brighter, as if celebrating their victory. "I couldn't have done this without you," Alexander said, his voice low. Sophia leaned against him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You could have. But I'm glad you didn't have to." He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. In that moment, the trials they had faced felt worth it, their bond stronger than ever. The early December frost painted the Vermont landscape in shades of silver and white, a tranquil backdrop for the emotional storm brewing within the Blake estate. The fallout from Elliot's betrayal lingered like a specter, but for the first time in years, the family began to confront their long-buried pain. Margaret, Alexander, and Sophia found themselves at the center of this fragile reconciliation, each grappling with the weight of the past, while cautiously embracing the possibility of healing. In the days following the gala, Sophia immersed herself in her art, using it as both a distraction and a means of expression. Her makeshift studio, in the estate's sunroom, became a sanctuary. Large canvases, adorned with vibrant colors and bold strokes, depicted scenes of resilience and connection, visions she hoped to bring to life within the Blake family. Margaret often wandered into the studio, silently observing Sophia's work. Though still guarded, her demeanor softened with each visit. "These are unexpected," Margaret remarked one afternoon, her voice lacking its usual sharpness. Sophia paused, wiping paint from her hands. "Unexpected good or unexpected bad?" Margaret hesitated. "Good. Very good, actually." Sophia smiled, a small but meaningful victory in her ongoing effort to bridge the gap between them. Meanwhile, Alexander threw himself into repairing the damage Elliot's actions had inflicted on the Blake Foundation. Late nights in his study became routine, but Sophia's presence offered him solace. She often brought him tea, her quiet support reminding him that he didn't have to shoulder the burden alone. During one such evening, Alexander looked up from his desk, his eyes tired but grateful. "You know, you've changed everything." Sophia tilted her head. "Everything?" He nodded. "This house, my family, me, none of it would be the same without you." Sophia placed her hand over his. "And you've given me something I never thought I'd have. A place to belong." As Christmas approached, Margaret surprised everyone by organizing a family dinner, an event she hadn't hosted since Alexander's father's departure years ago. The gesture, though understated, carried significant weight. It was her way of signaling a willingness to mend the fractures that had long defined their family. Sophia and Alexander helped with the preparations, their shared laughter filling the once quiet halls. Margaret watched them from a distance, a flicker of hope stirring within her. The dinner was intimate, yet meaningful. Conversations flowed more easily than expected, with even Margaret offering glimpses of her gentler side. For the first time in years, the Blake family began to feel whole. On Christmas Eve, Margaret called Sophia into her study. The room, filled with old books and family heirlooms, exuded a sense of history and nostalgia. "I wanted to give you something," Margaret said, handing Sophia a small, intricately wrapped box. Sophia opened it to reveal the Blake family locket, a delicate piece adorned with an engraving of a snowflake. Inside, a tiny photograph of Alexander as a child, with his brother and father stared back at her. "This locket belonged to my mother," Margaret explained. "She gave it to me when I married into the Blake family. It's a symbol of resilience, of weathering storms together. I think you've earned it." Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. I don't know what to say." Margaret smiled faintly. "Just take care of him. And this family." The next morning, the estate buzzed with quiet anticipation. Snow fell steadily, blanketing the grounds in pristine white. Margaret gathered everyone in the great hall, where a towering Christmas tree stood adorned with twinkling lights and ornaments from years past. To everyone's surprise, Margaret unveiled a framed painting, one of Sophia's works. It depicted the Blake estate, not as it was, but as it could be, warm, inviting, and filled with life. "This is what I want for our family," Margaret said, her voice uncharacteristically emotional. "A home where we can all feel safe, supported, and loved." Alexander stepped forward, his arm around Sophia. "We'll make it happen." The moment felt like a turning point, a symbolic step toward healing and unity. For the first time in years, the Blakes celebrated Christmas not as individuals bound by obligation, but as a family united by choice. Later that evening, Alexander and Sophia retreated to the terrace, the snowy landscape stretching before them like a blank canvas. A fire crackled in the outdoor hearth, casting a warm glow over their faces. Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I know it's not the right time yet, but I wanted you to have this." Inside was a ring, simple yet elegant, with a single diamond that sparkled like the snow around them. Sophia's breath caught. "Alexander," he smiled. "This isn't a proposal, not yet. It's a promise. A promise that when the time is right, I'll ask you properly." Tears glistened in Sophia's eyes as she nodded. "And when you do, I'll say yes." They kissed under the falling snow, their future full of possibilities. As the night drew to a close, Margaret stood by the window, watching Alexander and Sophia from afar. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope, not just for her son, but for the legacy they were building together. In her heart, she knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter for the Blake family. And for the first time in years, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The days following Christmas were filled with a quiet but determined energy. The Blake estate, once a place of shadows and silence, now echoed with the sounds of laughter and meaningful conversation. Yet, beyond the snow-covered grounds of Vermont, the world loomed full of challenges and opportunities, awaiting both Alexander and Sophia. As the holiday warmth began to fade, the couple prepared to step into the broader arena of their respective ambitions, knowing the stakes were higher than ever before. Sophia's work, nurtured in the solitude of the Blake estate, caught the attention of prominent art circles. An invitation to exhibit her paintings at a New York gallery marked a significant milestone in her career. For Sophia, this was more than a professional opportunity. It was validation of her talent and resilience. "Are you ready for this?" Alexander asked, watching as she carefully packed her pieces for transport. Sophia looked up, a mix of excitement and apprehension in her eyes. "I think so, but what if they don't like it?" "They will," Alexander said firmly, "because it's you. And they'll see what I see, a brilliance that's impossible to ignore." Sophia smiled, his unwavering support bolstering her confidence. "You always know what to say." As Sophia prepared for her trip to New York, Margaret approached her with an unexpected gesture of support. "I'd like to attend the opening," Margaret said, her tone softer than usual. "If you don't mind." Sophia was momentarily stunned. Of course, I'd love that." Margaret nodded, a small but genuine smile gracing her lips. "You've proven yourself in ways I didn't think possible. It's time the world sees what you're capable of." While Sophia focused on her art, Alexander faced a different kind of challenge. Inspired by Sophia's influence, he began reevaluating his business practices. For years, the Blake family empire had thrived on cutthroat strategies and relentless ambition. But Alexander was determined to chart a new course, one rooted in ethics and sustainability. He convened a meeting with his executive team, outlining his vision for the company's future. The response was mixed, with some expressing skepticism about the shift in priorities. "You're risking our competitive edge," one board member argued. "I'm redefining it," Alexander countered. "The world is changing and so must we. Profit without purpose is hollow." His conviction resonated with a few key allies, setting the stage for gradual but meaningful change within the company. The day of the gallery opening arrived, bringing a flurry of nerves and anticipation. Sophia, dressed in a simple but elegant black dress, stood in the center of the bustling gallery. Surrounded by her creations, each painting told a story of struggle, hope, and transformation. Margaret, true to her word, attended the event alongside Alexander. Her presence added an air of gravitas, drawing the attention of art critics and collectors alike. As Sophia greeted guests, a prominent gallery owner approached her. "Your work is extraordinary," he said. "Raw, yet refined. I'd like to discuss a long-term collaboration." Sophia's eyes widened in disbelief. "Thank you. I'd be honored." Alexander, watching from a distance, felt a surge of pride. This was Sophia's moment, and she was shining. Despite the triumphs of the gallery opening, challenges soon emerged. Elliot, bitter and vengeful, after his public disgrace, began sowing seeds of discord within the Blake family's business network. Leveraging his connections, he attempted to undermine Alexander's efforts to reform the company. "Do you really think you can undo decades of tradition?" Elliot sneered during a tense encounter. Alexander met his cousin's gaze with steely resolve. "Watch me." Sophia, too, faced criticism. A scathing review from a high-profile critic questioned the authenticity of her work, accusing her of leveraging her relationship with Alexander for fame. "That's ridiculous," Alexander fumed when he read the article. "They don't know you." "It's part of the territory," Sophia said, her tone measured but firm. "I can handle it." The challenges only served to strengthen Sophia and Alexander's bond. Together, they navigated the pressures of public scrutiny and personal ambition, supporting each other through every setback and success. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Alexander took Sophia's hand. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Sophia nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude and love. Together. As the chapter drew to a close, both Alexander and Sophia stood on the cusp of new beginnings. Sophia's art gained further recognition, with offers pouring in from galleries across the country. Alexander's reforms within the Blake Empire began to take root, earning him respect even from his critics. Margaret, witnessing their growth, felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope, not just for her son, but for the legacy they were building together. As snow continued to blanket the Vermont estate, the Blake family prepared for the next chapter of their journey, a journey defined not by wealth or power, but by love, resilience, and the courage to change. The Vermont estate was bathed in the soft glow of a winter sunset. Snow clung to the trees like delicate lace, and the air carried the crisp, invigorating chill of a January evening. The holiday decorations had long been taken down, but the warmth and love that had blossomed during Christmas remained. It was within this serene setting that Alexander prepared to rewrite a moment he once thought was destined to remain cold and calculated. In the days following Sophia's triumphant gallery opening, life had settled into a rhythm. Sophia continued to balance her growing career as an artist with her newfound role in Alexander's world. Meanwhile, Alexander's business reforms were gaining traction, albeit not without resistance from certain factions of the Blake Empire. Despite the challenges, the couple had found solace in each other. Their bond had deepened, evolving from a partnership of convenience into something neither could deny was real. But Alexander knew that words alone could not convey the depth of his feelings. He needed to take action, something bold, heartfelt, and entirely uncharacteristic of the man he once was. Alexander spent days meticulously planning the proposal. He sought input from Margaret, whose unexpected warmth toward Sophia had grown into genuine fondness. Together, they worked to create an evening that would not only honor Sophia, but also reflect the journey they had shared. "It must be meaningful," Alexander said one evening, poring over details with his mother. "She deserves more than an extravagant gesture." Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sophia isn't one for grandiosity, Alexander. Focus on what matters to her: authenticity, connection, and love." Her words struck a chord. Alexander decided to incorporate elements of their story, the moments that had brought them closer, the trials they had overcome, and the shared dreams that now bound them together. On the evening of the proposal, Alexander invited Sophia for a walk through the estate grounds. The air was brisk, and the snow crunched softly beneath their boots as they made their way to the frozen lake at the edge of the property. Sophia, wrapped in a thick scarf and her favorite coat, glanced at Alexander curiously. "You're unusually quiet tonight. Something on your mind?" Alexander smiled, his usual stoicism giving way to a rare vulnerability. "There's always something on my mind, but tonight, it's all about you." Sophia raised an eyebrow, her playful sarcasm masking the flutter in her chest. "That sounds ominous." "Trust me," Alexander said, taking her hand. "You'll like where this is going." When they reached the lake, Sophia gasped. The entire surface was illuminated by hundreds of candles placed along the shoreline, their flickering light reflecting off the ice like stars scattered across the heavens. In the center of the lake, an easel stood, holding a blank canvas. "This," Sophia whispered, her voice catching. "This is incredible. Did you—" "I did," Alexander said, leading her closer. "But it's not finished yet. That part is up to you." Sophia turned to him, her eyes glistening with emotion. "What do you mean?" Alexander knelt on one knee, pulling a small, elegantly crafted box from his coat pocket. Inside was a ring, simple, yet breathtakingly beautiful, with a single sapphire surrounded by diamonds. "Sophia Grant," Alexander began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "When I first met you, I thought I was offering you a lifeline. But the truth is, you saved me. You brought color to a life I didn't realize was gray, and warmth to a heart I thought was beyond repair." Sophia's breath hitched, her hand covering her mouth. "This time," Alexander continued, "there's no contract, no calculation, just love, pure and unshakable. Will you marry me, not as part of a deal, but as my partner, my equal, and the love of my life?" For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Sophia looked at the man before her, the once aloof and guarded Alexander, now bearing his soul with complete sincerity. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, standing to pull her into his arms. They stayed like that for a while, the cold forgotten, as they basked in the warmth of their love. The couple returned to the estate, where Margaret and a small group of close friends and family awaited them with a surprise celebration. Sophia was greeted with genuine affection and congratulations, a stark contrast to the cold reception she had once received. Margaret pulled her aside during the festivities. "You've changed him, you know," she said softly. Sophia smiled, glancing at Alexander across the room. "We've changed each other." Later that night, as the celebration wound down, Margaret sat alone in her study, holding the heirloom that had once belonged to Alexander's estranged father. She turned it over in her hands, lost in thought. "It's time," she murmured to herself, her decision solidifying. "Time to pass it on." The proposal marked not just a new chapter for Alexander and Sophia, but also a turning point for the Blake family. Together, they had begun to rewrite their story, one of love, redemption, and hope for the future. As the snow continued to fall outside, Alexander and Sophia stood at the window, their hands intertwined. "What do you see?" Alexander asked. "A future," Sophia said, her voice filled with quiet determination. Our future, the Vermont estate, was alive with an air of celebration. Snow blanketed the grounds in pristine white, reflecting the soft glow of lanterns and twinkling lights that adorned the sprawling mansion. This evening was no ordinary gathering. It was a milestone, a convergence of past struggles and future promise. Alexander and Sophia's engagement had brought together the Blake family, their friends, and a community of individuals whose lives had been touched by their journey. For the first time in years, the Blake estate felt like more than a symbol of power. It was a home, brimming with warmth and possibility. Sophia stood at the center of the grand hall, her presence commanding attention, yet radiating humility. She had grown comfortable in her role within the Blake family, not by assimilating into their world of wealth and status, but by reshaping it with her authenticity. She was no longer the struggling artist who had entered this life through a hastily drawn contract. Sophia Grant was now a force of change, a partner to Alexander, an inspiration to Margaret, and a counterbalance to the ambition that had once consumed the Blake legacy. As she moved through the room, engaging with guests, she caught snippets of conversation. Praise for her gallery opening in New York, admiration for her resilience, and, most importantly, genuine interest in her perspective. "It's not just about the art," Sophia explained to a curious guest. It's about connection, about telling stories that resonate and bring people together. Her words resonated not just with her audience, but with Alexander, who watched her from across the room, his pride evident in his expression. Margaret Blake had undergone a transformation of her own. The icy matriarch, who once ruled the family with sharp wit and colder judgment, was now a woman embracing vulnerability. She had come to see Sophia not as an interloper, but as the catalyst for a long overdue shift within the family. Margaret's decision to pass on the family heirloom, a delicate brooch with intricate engravings, symbolized more than inheritance. It was a gesture of trust, an acknowledgement of the role Sophia now played in their shared legacy. "I've held on to this for far too long," Margaret said, placing the brooch into Sophia's hands during a quiet moment. "It's time for new hands to carry its weight." Sophia, moved by the gesture, promised to honor its history while forging a future that reflected her values. Elliot, once the thorn in Sophia's side, had finally met his match in the consequences of his own actions. His schemes to discredit Sophia and regain control of the Blake fortune had been exposed, leaving him disgraced and estranged from the family. As the celebration unfolded, Elliot stood on the periphery, a shadow of his former self. The once charismatic manipulator now grappled with the weight of his failures. For the first time, he saw the family not as a source of power, but as a foundation he had fractured with his selfishness. Sophia approached him cautiously, her empathy overriding any lingering resentment. "Elliot," she said softly, "everyone deserves a second chance, but it's up to you to earn it." Her words, though simple, planted a seed of reflection in Elliot, a glimmer of hope for redemption. The evening culminated in a heartfelt toast, led by Alexander. Standing beside Sophia, he addressed the gathered crowd, his voice steady and full of conviction. "This family has seen its share of challenges," Alexander began, "but tonight we celebrate more than an engagement. We celebrate growth, understanding, and the power of love to transform even the most unyielding of hearts." He turned to Sophia, his gaze unwavering. "You've shown us what it means to be resilient, to fight for what matters, and to bring light into even the darkest corners. For that, we are all grateful." The room erupted into applause, a symphony of support and affirmation. Sophia's heart swelled, not from the recognition, but from the knowledge that they were building something real, something that would last. Later that night, Margaret retired to her study, her thoughts drifting to the future. The brooch she had given Sophia was more than a token. It was a bridge to the past, a reminder of the family's roots and the lessons learned along the way. Margaret began drafting a letter, her words a reflection of her journey and a guide for the generations to come. She wrote of resilience, of the importance of choosing love over pride, and of the legacy she hoped Alexander and Sophia would carry forward. Her pen hovered over the final lines. "The Blake name will no longer be a symbol of power alone. It will stand for integrity, compassion, and unity." As the celebration wound down, the Blake family gathered around the fireplace, sharing stories, laughter, and a renewed sense of togetherness. Sophia sat beside Alexander, her hand resting on his, while Margaret watched them with quiet contentment. For the first time in years, the Blake estate felt like a home's, not just for those who lived there, but for the values they now shared. The fractures that once divided them had healed, replaced by a foundation built on love, respect, and hope for the future. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the estate in a serene stillness. Within its walls, a family united prepared to embark on a new chapter, one where their legacy would be defined, not by wealth or status, but by the strength of their bonds. The Vermont estate, had never looked more breathtaking. The grounds, covered in a fresh layer of glistening snow, shimmered under the pale winter sunlight. Rows of pine trees adorned with silver and gold ornaments lined the pathways leading to the grand hall, where the final preparations for Alexander and Sophia's wedding were underway. It was a day that promised to mark against not just a union of two lives, but the culmination of a journey that had redefined love, family, and legacy. Sophia stood in front of a full-length mirror in one of the estate's lavish guest rooms. Her wedding gown, a masterpiece of understated elegance, flowed like liquid silk, its simplicity accentuating her natural beauty. As Margaret adjusted the delicate lace veil, the matriarch's normally sharp demeanor softened into something warm and tender. "You look perfect," Margaret said, her voice carrying an uncharacteristic quiver. "Your presence has brought this family together in ways I never thought possible." Sophia turned to face her soon-to-be mother-in-law, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "And you've shown me what it means to stand strong for the people you love." Their hands clasped for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken bond they now shared. In another room, Alexander adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his reflection in the mirror revealing a man transformed. Gone was the cold, calculated businessman who once viewed relationships as transactional. In his place stood someone who had rediscovered his capacity for vulnerability, hope, and unconditional love. David, his lifelong friend and best man, entered the room with a mischievous grin. "You look like a man who's about to conquer the world." "Not the world," Alexander replied, his tone light but sincere. "Just the heart of the woman I can't imagine living without." David chuckled, then grew serious. "You've come a long way, Alex. Today isn't just about Sophia. It's about you finally finding peace with yourself." Alexander nodded, the weight of David's words settling over him like a comforting truth. "It's because of her," he admitted. "She saw the man I could be, even when I didn't." As guests gathered in the grand hall, a hush fell over the room. The space had been transformed into a winter wonderland, with cascading white roses and flickering candles casting a warm glow. A string quartet played a soft melodic tune as the bridal procession began. Sophia walked down the aisle, her arm linked with James Harper, the elderly neighbor who had become a father figure to her. Her eyes met Alexander's, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The room disappeared, leaving only the two of them, bound by a love that had weathered every storm. The officiant's words were both traditional and deeply personal, weaving in anecdotes from Alexander and Sophia's journey. When it came time for their vows, Alexander spoke first. "I've spent my life building walls," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Walls to protect myself, to keep others out. But you, Sophia, you didn't just climb those walls, you tore them down, brick by brick, with your kindness, your strength, and your unwavering belief in me." Sophia's voice trembled slightly as she responded. "When we met, I thought we were too different to ever understand each other. But through every challenge, you've shown me that love isn't about being the same. It's about growing together, about choosing each other every single day." Their vows ended with a kiss that brought the room to its feet in applause and cheers. The snow outside seemed to dance in celebration, mirroring the joy within. The reception was held in a stunning glass pavilion on the estate grounds, where laughter and music filled the air. Sophia's art was prominently displayed, a testament to her journey and the dreams she had fought so hard to keep alive. Guests mingled, sharing stories and toasts that celebrated not just the newlyweds, but the transformation their love had inspired in everyone around them. Margaret took a moment to deliver a toast that surprised even herself. To Alexander and Sophia, she began, her voice steady. You've shown us that love is not just about finding someone to share your life with. It's about finding someone who makes you want to be better, who inspires you to leave the world a little brighter than you found it. The toast was met with heartfelt applause, and Margaret's words lingered in the air, a poignant reminder of how far the family had come. As the evening wound down, Alexander and Sophia stole away from the crowd for a quiet moment beneath the stars. The snow crunched softly under their feet as they walked hand in hand, the estate glowing in the distance. "This feels like a dream," Sophia whispered, leaning into Alexander's warmth. "It's our reality now," he replied, his voice filled with conviction. "And it's just the beginning." They paused by a frozen pond, its surface glinting like a mirror in the moonlight. Alexander knelt down, pulling a small box from his pocket. Inside was a delicate pendant shaped like a snowflake, its intricate design symbolizing the uniqueness of their love. "I had this made for you," he said, fastening it around her neck, "to remind you that, like snowflakes, no two loves are the same. Ours is one of a kind." Tears glistened in Sophia's eyes as she touched the pendant. "It's perfect," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The story concluded not with an ending, but with a beginning. Alexander and Sophia's union marked a turning point, not just for themselves, but for everyone they had touched. Their love, born from adversity and nurtured by mutual respect, became a beacon of hope. As they danced under the stars, surrounded by the love of their family and friends, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a promise of new beginnings. And in that moment, as laughter and music echoed into the night, it was clear that their legacy would be one of love eternal. Proof that even in the coldest winters, warmth and light could prevail. As the snow settles on the story of Alexander and Sophia, we're reminded that love, in all its forms, has the power to change not just lives, but entire legacies. Their journey from strangers to soulmates is proof that even in the coldest winters, warmth can find its way into our hearts. But what about you? What moments in this story resonated with your own life? Was it Sophia's unyielding courage or Alexander's transformation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if this tale stirred something in you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There's so much more to come. New stories, new journeys, and new characters that will inspire, challenge, and captivate you. Together, let's keep uncovering the magic of human connection, one story at a time. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time, stay warm, stay hopeful, and always believe in the power of love. See you in the next chapter. Star.